Yeah, it's recording.
Here's the goal. This is going to be good stuff.
Anyway, so I hacked this talk from about 50 plus minutes to about 30 or minutes or so it's going to be a little discombobulated, so I'll try to get kind of the meat of it. So the project is called Security Outliers, and the subtitle, Cultural Cues from High-Risk Professions. The idea was, how do we take a look at other regulated, licensed, more advanced, if you will, in their formality and experience. Professions like that and incorporate the appropriate aspects of risk management and cultural approaches that they have built into their training, education, as well as operations and audit, etc. Things like flight, medicine, surgery, special operations, people like that that have inherently risky jobs where the tactical is really implicit in strategic outcomes. And so that's the idea. My collaborator, you might have known of him from Twitter, his name on Twitter is Dr. Infosec, Chris Beltsos, PhD, CSSP, CISA, CIPP, GCFA, I'm sure he's working on a couple others. I'm not a doctor. So basically what we've done is we've put together a layer 8 approach. So we're not dropping O-days on you, it's not about lead hacksaws, this is not about anything like that. It's basically a layer 8 type of a talk, and we've both done this kind of in our spare time. I need your help to make this more appropriate to the types of teams that you're involved with. So InfoSec has become kind of like medicine or the military or surgery, where these hyper-specialized little micro niches where everybody's really, really good at one thing. It used to be 10 years ago, if you knew a firewall and an IDS and some antivirus, you were a security guru, right? And now it's like, I'm an IDS guy. Really, what kind? Or I'm an endpoint security guy. Oh, you do full disk encryption? Like, what is it that you do? Are you host intrusion detection? What kind of endpoint security? Right? Do you do VDI security? What kind of endpoint security? This becomes so fractionated. It's not a technical talk. It is how do we integrate stuff, and how do we attack the layer 8, the politics, the business, the communication layer that puts it all together. So some of this is based on kind of my experience in working with CSO type people in big companies and big universities. There's a lot of politics that constrains the big budgets and the technical know-how that is resident there. But this is a layer 8 talk, not a technical talk, so I want your help to figure out where some of these analogies or approaches are appropriate in information security, if at all. So what's the deal with security outliers? I'm just gonna fix this thing up. There we go. Okay. Security outliers came to me in a flash as I was watching, I think, C-SPAN Book TV, because I'm not a nerd, and this dude with a really huge afro, reminiscent of my old afro. And some of you have seen pictures, it exists. His name is Malcolm Gladwell. He was on Book TV, and he was talking about his book called Outliers, and he talked about a particular part of the book that was about aviation disasters and aviation safety, not security like TSA, as we heard from Deviant earlier today, but more about aviation safety and how do we get planes off the ground and then back on the ground in the same fashion as they took off. Same amount of live people, functioning aircraft. So that's quite a huge area of research in psychology, cockpit resource management, a lot of interesting things in layer 8 type of stuff. Even when all the airplanes and the systems are working just fine, there are still problems and people die and crash into mountains and stuff. So that fascinated me, and it's really reminded me a lot of my CSO customers that I consult to and help them figure out how to get things done on the network. And the idea here again is figure out how do we take lessons learned, literally with dead people on the ground and charred remains, and translate those lessons learned from very high-risk professions into information security. And I think you'll see some parallels here. So the idea is kind of create a leadership project where we take people who are technical and are going to move up the ranks and become chief security officers or directors of network security, whatever the issue is, and help them understand that political layer and that communications issue. And then also work with people who have backgrounds, let's say in law or management, who has JDs and MBA types that are now becoming all of our bosses, right? The people who are the executives. So information security has changed. As Nickerson said, money changed the game. And there's a lot of money in information security and maybe even more so in compliance. And politics communications is a big piece of that. Technology is in some sense, almost secondary. And so in my copious spare time when I'm not Twittering all the time, I'm looking at this. And the future state is going to be a wiki, a website, maybe some trainings at cons, etc. And it basically consists of interviews with people who are leadership and practitioners in high-risk professions, as well as some academic research. And obviously, Dr. Velsos focused on academic research, and I focus more on the interviews. I'm actually going to be doing some things with high-risk professional people, checking out their training, going to their bases, going to their trainings and talking to them, and trying to experience some of these things and report back to you. And hilarity will ensue, I guarantee it. So the idea of the aviation disaster, we're looking at typically an aviation disaster results from about 7 consecutive errors. And that basically means any of those 7 errors in and of itself would not have caused a disaster, but together when you chain them in just the right order and the right circumstances, you have that perfect storm kind of thing, and then really bad things happen. And people have studied aviation disasters and figured out that in many cases, maybe even in most cases, it involves errors of teamwork and communication. Not suddenly the airplane blew up, or suddenly a fuel line went bad, or suddenly an engine dropped out of the sky. Because, interesting enough, the pilots are well trained to deal with those, and when those do happen, they typically solve them with their training. Okay, so compensate for it in some way in a technical fashion, it's a technical issue. But the real disasters happen when there are teamwork and communications errors, and something doesn't go right between the wetware in the cockpit. Security breaches, the folks from the Verizon Business Blog, about a month after Veltos and I presented at RSA in March of 2010, they came up with this and said, they happen exactly like that, like aviation disasters. They're the result of a combination of minor or seemingly insignificant errors. And again, if you read one book this Christmas season, I would recommend the paperback Outliers. Go to directly, I think it's chapter 7, where he talks about the aviation disasters and look at this stuff. So one example we'll go through is Korean Air 801 to Guam. Korean Air had a major problem with flying into things they weren't supposed to be flying into and killing people. And that's a technical term. 4.79 per million departures in terms of accidents, as opposed to 0.27 per million departures. This is, for example, United Airlines, which is a major U.S. carrier. So the average major U.S. carrier back then, when they're comparing them, was 0.27 per million departures, and Korean Air was almost 5. So 17x over the normal American airliner. Why is that? They hired people to study it. Why? Because they were about to get decertified from flying over North American airspace, which if you're running a for-profit business is really bad for your bottom line, right? So you can't come in over Canada or the United States because we don't trust you to operate really big machinery laden with fuel and 500 people over our airspace. And certainly not land at our airports where you will run into other. Yes? Yeah? So they had to really understand something fundamental was missing. What was going on? And they figured out that in many cases, again, teamwork, error, communications, it was actually a linguistic and communication error issue, a layer 8 wetware problem. Specifically, what some of the people they brought in the aviation safety area look at inter-cockpit communications. Cockpit resource management, so between a captain and a first officer and a navigator, and then between the cockpit and ground control, for example. These are different types of communications. At least when we're talking within the crew, we speak the same language, we're from the same culture, we've gone through the same training program, we have some of the same SOPs, but now we're talking to ground control JFK, or now we're talking to ground control in Bogota, or now we're talking to ground control in Tokyo. And that's an extra layer of complexity and newness and innovation, if you will. Every time you land at a different airport, it's a different intercultural gap that you have to make sure to understand how they're doing it. So the previous one we were talking about, Aviation Airlines, they actually were circling JFK and trying to talk to the ground crew there. And if anybody, we have a couple people here from New York, and you know, the folks from the Colombian Air were trying to talk to JFK ground crew and said, hey, we kind of want to land, and it ended up being brushed aside by the JFK people because the JFK people didn't really feel the urgency, and what ended up happening was that the plane literally ran out of fuel circling JFK and fell to the ground, which is goddamn ridiculous. But it happened, and it was strictly a communication issue. The Colombian folks in the cockpit, well-trained pilots that operated a fairly safe aircraft, just plowed into the ground because they ran out of fuel circling a major airport in the United States. Because the difference in communication between JFK ground crew and their cockpit. In the Korean era, it was more of an issue of what's called power distance. What does this have to do with technology? Nothing at all. It's all about the weather, right? So psychologists and linguists figured out that there are several ways to mitigate language. And we all do this every day when we talk to our friends and our spouses and our bosses and our subordinates and our friends and family, etc. So the first one, look at this kind of a hint. Hey, those clouds ahead, they look menacing. Right? How about a preference? Wouldn't it be good to do X, Y, Z? And then a query, how would you like to do this? Moving up the stack to a little bit more of a suggestion, let's do this. And then a crew obligation statement, we need to comply with PCI. I mean, we need to not plow into that mountain. And then a command, do. Now, in some cases, when pilots get trained, if you're a captain, you outrank me in the cockpit, and I'm a first officer, let's say, and I report to you essentially, but I'm as well trained almost, if not as well trained as you in the cockpit, but formally you're in command. If I see you do something that you're so endangering everybody behind that cockpit door, and we're about to climb a mountain or do something really dangerous, and I don't have time to explain to you the nature of the disaster that you've steered us into, I will actually grab the controls and say, aircraft is mine, and your sole response will be, aircraft is yours. I'm not a pilot, but I talk to people, and that's basically, at that point, we skip over all the mitigating language and just go, aircraft is mine, right? And they train with this kind of stuff, but in some cases, in Korean Airlines, for example, was not enough. And so they had figured out, over all the cockpit crew that they've studied, the linguists, captains would issue commands, and most first officers would hint all the way down the stack. So formality of rank and hierarchy, which in information security is kind of like, ugh, that's gross, right? Who does that? We don't need that. That actually exists in a lot of other professions, most other professions, much more in a kind of a formal and strict and hierarchical way. And in InfoSec, we're a little bit more averse to that kind of environment. But in some cases, it's actually really good to be averse to over-deference to rank, because what happened at Korean Airlines, the people who studied it basically said that it was a cultural issue. It was not their aircraft that were not the right aircraft. They had great aircraft. It was not their ground crew that were turning the knobs and switches wrong. They were maintaining the right nuts and bolts, they were putting the right fuel in, all that good stuff. So it wasn't the ground crew, it wasn't the pilot training, it wasn't the aircraft themselves. It was strictly a cultural issue. It was an over-deference to rank inside the cockpit. And so when someone eventually did something stupid that was going to steer them into a mountain, the ocean, whatever, then the people whose responsibility was to say everybody on that plane, say, airplane is mine, or move up a stack a little quicker from hint to crew obligation statement, for example, they wouldn't do that because they were afraid of being not deferential to rank. And so that was strictly a cultural issue, and they ended up fixing it. And they said, hey, nothing personal, Captain, but your first officer, your navigator, and your crew are going to call you on it, and that's their job, and you can't do anything about it. So that's the big change that happened. So, you don't have to answer this, but does this list remind you of somewhere where you've worked and you said, hey, screw this place, I can't work here. They don't listen to me, they don't get it, their management is really, all about rank and power games and not about getting things done. So we gotta be careful to not be too rigid or too soft, but find that balance within the particular situation that we're running. So looking into how big disasters happen, they talk about the Swiss cheese effect. And it's basically looking at all these accidents, human factor analysis, and this FAA study this kind of stuff. It's a little bit old, but the general principle is here, is that aviation accidents cannot be attributed to a single cause or even a single individual. It used to be when, 70s, 80s, people were like, let's go and investigate this aviation accident and see if it was pilot error. And so people wanted to know, is it the pilot? Or is it not the pilot? And in reality, there's a lot more than that, because the huge system of interacting, interlocking components from the ground crew to weather to all these things going on inside the crew and between the crew and the ground control. So all these things come together, and they found Swiss cheese. And Swiss cheese looks kind of like this, or these are some of the problems: organizational influence, unsafe supervision, preconditions for unsafe acts, and actual unsafe acts, active failure, what we call it, kind of a fun term, active failure. And when the holes in the Swiss cheese align just right, think about a hunk of Swiss cheese, a triangle of Swiss cheese, and you shine a laser through it, and just at the right alignment, it'll come out the other side. And that's when things go boom. So this is what that looks like. All these things together align just right or wrong, and then you have dead people in a shark bodies.
Yay.
Any questions?
Hey, did you talk about, I have to nip out real quick. Did you talk about the language thing?
Yeah, the mitigation.
I mean, the actual, how they made the South Korean when they speak in English. Did you talk about that?
No, I didn't want to go into that level of detail.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, because it kind of relates to what he was talking about,
Okay.
how security people have to communicate in different languages, business language. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to a little bit about that in terms of CSO layer. So to me, the CSO is kind of the layer between the people who do the technical work and are their technical job, and the people who are kind of the executives in the business, or in some cases, other pieces of the business like development, operations. They have to be the liaison and the champion and the translation from our technical talk to finance, to budget, to operations, to dev, et cetera, and get people to cooperate with us. So I think I'll incorporate Marcus' suggestion. He's also read the book and has some specifics about how to train people to talk in a language that the other team that you're talking to, kind of intercultural, will literally understand, using their terminology and standard terminology. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So again, please read the book Outliers and help contribute. I'm going to probably put up a website in a couple of weeks when I have some downtime over Crystal Content. So, talked about this, and medicine. So medicine obviously has its own safety and quality issues. And it always fascinated me. I used to be an EMT, and my first probationary period at Red Cross when I was an EMT in the 90s, I showed up there in my starched and ironed uniform, and I thought I was cool. And I got attached to a pretty experienced EMT, and then there was a charge nurse involved, and we got a call, and we ran, probably half a mile to find this 70-something-year-old woman who was having chest pains, radiating pain to the arm, classic heart attack stuff. And I was setting up the oxygen, and as the senior EMT I was attached to was interviewing her and kind of helping calm her down, I was expecting the when I pressurized the hose to give her oxygen, as we were waiting for the rig to come in, and I heard nothing, right? So failures like that are very similar to a lot of the problems that we have, is that, somebody forgot to take the perfectly good technology and perfectly good people, and there was a failure in little accountability in the shift change, right? Nobody switched out to fresh oxygen. Now, she ended up being just fine because the rig came literally right then as I was doing the technical tap on the O2 pressure gauge. because I literally thought I was hallucinating. This can't be happening, right? That would have been a huge, easy lawyer Rolls Royce right there. Because even for volunteers, a failure to do just the basics, right? Oxygen as an EMT. So we talked a little bit about checklists with some of the medical people we spoke with, and obviously aviation has a major reliance on checklists and doing proper procedure. And if you talk to fighter pilots or pilots, they tell you if you ever get in an aircraft and you see the pilot just kind of skipping stuff, especially for the small aircraft, you don't see them doing circling the airplane and checking everything out and the list, get the hell out of that airplane. Just get out. Doesn't matter. Could be Claudia Schiffer taking you to the Caribbean. Get out of that airplane. Whoever the male model equivalent is of Claudia Schiffer substitute. Sorry, I don't know. Chris Nickerson could be taken to the Caribbean. No, he's tough. But seriously, folks. So medicine, aviation, military, they have specific, rigid education training requirements and operational, very, very important quality assurance metrics and huge databases of what works and what doesn't, which is where our profession is starting to get to. Like we're starting to get better at understanding what works and what doesn't, getting a little bit better visibility of metrics. So the issue with medical folks is that they actually started learning from the aviation community, and I was interviewing a ER doc who was responsible for training ER docs at UCLA residency program for emergency medicine. And he said they were looking at aviation and said, okay, one of the things that research practitioners learned about is how to deal with systems thinking, checklists, liability, personal versus systemic. And what they did was they looked at, a few decades ago, it was again, was this pilot responsible for this accident, as opposed to what was the big system, the Swiss cheese effect. So they're looking at this now and thinking, how can we get doctors, or maybe even information security folks, to report problems and near misses? It used to be if you're a pilot and you died in a crash, well, guess what? People knew that you died in a crash and it was either your fault or not, and then people became more sophisticated and said, okay, systems thinking, where did all these 7 mistakes line up in Swiss cheese? But then they did something smart because they wanted to get better metrics. They wanted to understand, what about all the near misses? What if there were 4 or 5 or 6 pieces of Swiss cheese holes that were lining and the 7th one was just near the surface? We want to know what that looks like. How prevalent are they? What are those 4 or 5 links in that chain, right? And so they changed the liability and they started sharing information without blaming the pilots individually, because again, looking at the big system. So they got a lot more understanding of the big picture of the near misses in aviation disasters and made it a lot more safe for everybody else to fly. I spoke with a vascular surgeon that talked about implementing what was described in Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, which I also recommend you read. It's an amazing book about how to implement checklists properly and what kind of checklists are there and where they fit, where they don't, where they come from. And it always was interesting, kind of like when I was an EMT in the Red Cross, and they gave me an oxygen kit with an empty oxygen bottle, right? An inexcusable, ridiculous mistake. How does a surgeon with 20 years experience, went to med school, got his internship, his residency, and then 15 years more experience, etc., how do they go into an operating room, air conditioned, well lit, and then take off the wrong leg? What's up with that? Right. So they came out with a universal safe first surgery checklist and started implementing it. And one of the issues is, how do we get these specialty surgeons who are kind of the rock stars of our industry, they're kind of the drop in the O-day people of the medicine community, right? How do we get those people who are very, very experienced, very well, highly trained, specialized, do amazing things, miracle workers every day, how do we get them to say, hey, we want you to listen to this nurse over here. She's your scrub nurse. She's not a big shot surgeon. She's not a rock star. The anesthesiologist over here, he's not a rock star. But you know what? You're a team, and you're responsible for the outcome of this surgery as a medical chief of that team, basically. And if you don't listen to the nurse anesthesiologist or some random janitor that came in and saw something, hey, this hose was making a hissing sound. Is that weird? Right? Good. And these are some of the things that he told me about, that they actually caught major mistakes and oversights that would have killed or maimed a patient, which is not good for the hospital, not good for the doctor, it's really not good for the patient and the family. So he explained how they went around inside the hospital community and basically tried to sell the concept of the safe surgery checklist, which is so basic and silly. Like, do we have blood of this type if we nick an artery? Right? What leg are we amputating? Things that look stupid, but are tragic consequences, right? Strategic consequences. And so the issue, and I don't have time to go through all the cultural stuff today, but we'll put all these interviews verbatim up on the website, is that you have to operate as a team and understand what your role is as a leader in the team or as a subordinate in a team, and figure out how to get the cultural play, the wetware interface with the technology and the whiz-bang stuff, and get that properly allocated and properly communicated when you're doing any sort of high-risk work. And in some cases, daily operations might be high-risk work, because if you're afraid to go to someone and say, hey, I think I saw something, I'm not sure I quite understand it. Is this weird? Or if you see a problem and there's a no whining mentality. I am scared of people who say no whining. No whining to me means I don't care. Is that weird? To me, no whining means I don't care. You come to me and with a problem that you may not know how to solve. Some people, have you ever heard people say, don't come to me with a problem unless you have a solution. Why don't you take a gun, stick it in your mouth, and just pull the trigger on your career? Because what you've done is completely cut off communications from people who daily see these types of oversights. Hey, your oxygen bottle's empty. Is that weird? Is that supposed to be like that? Hey, it looks like you're about to cut into the right leg, but I think I saw the cancer was in the left leg. Is that weird? Hey, don't come to me. Come on, people. So a lot of people who see problems aren't necessarily the people who can solve them. And what is a problem solution anyway these days? These are such complicated systems. We could take a steering committee of doctorates with 20 years experience and they'll come out with 7 different ideas on how to solve a problem. So don't tell people to not whine in a productive way. Tell them, come to me and spill it. I want to know what's going on. Shock trauma. Baltimore. Anybody here from Baltimore? Yeah, Baltimore. I love that place. It's the best place to get shot.
New Orleans.
Fair. No. Yeah. So, University of Pennsylvania, Wharton Business School, which is, I don't know, competes for number 1, 2, 3 best business school in the country after Harvard, Stanford, Chicago, depends on the day. They went out to shock trauma, which is part of the University of Maryland system, and said, hey, these guys have an amazing save rate. Like, you get shot, stabbed, shot and stabbed, run over, shot, stabbed, run over, dropped from a helicopter. And if you get wheeled into shock trauma, they're gonna do amazing things. They know how to save people. That's their specialty. And what they studied was, hey, why are those guys' scalpels sharper than over across the street at Hopkins? No, that's not what they did. They looked at leadership and looked at how people interact in a team. Why didn't they study the scalpels? Or why isn't their echocardiogram not better? Why isn't it that they get to the MRI faster?
How about the volume? It happens a lot, so therefore they're the most experienced with it.
Yes, but there is absolutely an element of experience, but the way they approach it was a specific aspect of this article. I recommend you read it, and we'll get you the slide if you want. You have to, we'll talk offline about that. Yeah, there's just not enough time. We have DDoS coming through.
That's your new name, Mike. DDoS.
Adidas Tom, sorry. So Martin Fisher, you might know him as Armor Guy on Twitter. I spent about 3 hours on the phone with him and typed verbatim until my hands were like claws, and came up with these gists of the interview. He came out from the Army, and he used to be, up until recently, the director of security incident response at the world's biggest airline. And these are some of the leadership perspectives I came to talk to him. He says, leverage newness and stability orientation to retain quality talent. So if you're out there looking for people to staff your team, or if you're a specialist, know yourself and know the people you're working with, because not everybody's the same, and not everybody's the same as you, and that's good. Because some people like stability, some people like innovation and newness. Figure that out about them and give them something to work with that complements that personality type. Definitely came from the Army. Obviously, he wanted to create planned disruptive change to test out readiness for incidents, which was their job as a team. He wanted to absolutely address the power distance issue that I asked him about from the aviation safety research, and he said that his style doesn't allow his subordinates that work from him to directly challenge his leadership or his authority, but rather he allows them to be wrong, and he gives them the authority and the latitude to take calculated risks. And he had some pretty interesting metrics that he said, when I was in the Army, no more financial damage than $1 million and nobody gets to get killed. But you can take risks that don't result in that. And he had some other metrics. Again, we're going to skip over some of this stuff. So this he specifically addressed. You can't tell me I'm not the boss and I can't tell you what to do, but you absolutely should take calculated risks, and you want to tell me when I'm wrong, and you want to tell me what your opinion is. Until I get to the point where I decide this is what we're going to do. Know your team. Who's emotional? Who's analytical? I'm going to go beaker on you because I got to finish this up a little bit. Balance being directive versus collaborative. Some people, in certain situations, there's a time to be collaborative. Hey, what's going on? What do you got? What are you finding? Why don't you do this over here? Why don't you do this over here? And then come back to me. And then at some point, he'll basically say, okay, it's time to be directive. In some cases, you're doing strategic planning. Let's talk about what's important. What's the new innovation we're going to implement this year? What should we talk about in terms of priorities for the budget? More collaborative. So he switches between collaborative and directive. And then collaborative is more, let's figure this out together, but I have the final decision. And facilitate people's ability to talk without fear of political repercussions. Your job as a leader is to let them come to you and whine, quote unquote, and tell you what they see. It's their job to tell you, what do I see that's wrong or needs improvement, even if I don't know the solution. Because again, we're dealing with rapidly evolving, complex situations. Nobody knows the solution, and certainly not the person who's mired in the technical details necessarily would know the solution, because a lot of times, again, this is systems thinking, big picture, so we have to get together, put our brains together and figure this out. Concept drills and scenarios, high intensity training, allows them to make mistakes and learn without actual consequences. Again, it might not be revolutionary to a lot of you, but I don't see this happening in a lot of places. And I've worked with some pretty big InfoSec teams. Mentor people, give opportunities to make mistakes, decisions in low-risk scenarios. Post-training, put pressure on them, but don't break them. Know your folks where it's too much. Right? Don't humiliate them ever. You can create an insider threat there. But put pressure on them to grow and help them get training and the resources they need. Leadership is a two-way street. As a leader, he came from the Army, he understood and explicitly ceded technical superiority to the people on his incident response team. Hey, I'm Martin, and I run this team, and I can tell you what to do when that's appropriate. What do you think is going on here technically? What is your expert opinion on this particular packet capture and this particular image that we created from this hard drive? Right? So he doesn't pretend to be technically better than the people who are technically better than him. Very big deal. Anybody have a boss like that? Care to give your full name? Smart people respond to given your style. If you're gonna create pain and hostility when they come and give you feedback, when they come and tell you, hey, I have a problem, or hey, I need to run something by you, and we have a wrap. If you're gonna create pain and hostility when they do that, you're gonna lose. You force them to shut up in order to avoid the pain. Kind of like the Zohan, right? Change the tone, avoid the pain. Right? Don't be the Zohan in that case. Don't be that guy. Sooner or later, it's a quote from him, right? response leader in the biggest airline in the world. Sooner or later, the circumstances come together to go bad in a catastrophic way. What? That kind of sounds like Swiss cheese. So, interviewing all these people from radically different parts of life, aviation, security, started talking to some people in special forces. In 2011, I talked to some people in pretty interesting kind of tier 1 type of people, not active anymore.
What special forces is that?
Special Army, special forces. Yeah. You know, yeah. So this is power distance turning to Swiss cheese. So every single leader that I identified and talked to essentially had this, paraphrasing the power distance and Swiss cheese effect. It's as if they conspired to say the exact same thing when asked an open question about what is your biggest leadership lesson. This, right here. Sooner or later, circumstances come together to go bad in a catastrophic way if you don't treat your people right and you don't let them talk to you. Ross Donaldson, he's in charge of the ER program at UCLA. Half a year he's teaching ER docs how to be ER docs in one of the busiest hospitals in the world. Half a year he goes to places like Sierra Leone and Iraq and other fun places where there are a lot less technical resources and a lot less liability as well. And he actually says he really loves practicing medicine in those types of places because he actually gets to practice medicine and not defend himself against theoretical liability, overtest, do all those kind of defensive medicine things. Interesting. He's the author of a very cool book called The Last Award. He was a third-year medical student, and he went to Sierra Leone, where there was a version of a acute, really nasty hemorrhagic fever, kind of like Ebola-like. And he inserted himself voluntarily in that situation. He wrote a pretty interesting book about that. And he talked about systems versus personal liability. So how can we in InfoSec, I don't know, it seems like maybe Alex Hutton and Verizon folks are starting to do this in the DBI or the VERA system. How do we get pull for InfoSec metrics? But the ideal for me of implementing that is we want to, there we go. We want to create safer practices by allowing small mistakes and then say, hey, I made a small mistake. As opposed to, hey, I made a small mistake. Oh, crap, I'm getting sued. Right? So how do we take that system from the aviation community and insert that into medicine as they did, but also potentially InfoSec? Because nobody here has ever been breached. Those other people have been breached. Right? Because we have firewalls and IDS and elite hackers working for us. So other companies have been breached, but we're safe. Except when, SB 1386 and its variants force us to report PII issues, but nobody wants to talk about being breached. That's starting to change a little bit because everybody's getting known. But I want to figure out how do we create a system that allows people to talk about being breached without some of the problems that said, hey, I was breached. And Varus is an interesting approach to getting some visibility to what kind of breaches are going on without some of the problems. So kind of like that program. I'm going to follow it and see what makes sense. This is kind of the airline model. It's encouraged to report near misses as well as obvious catastrophes that actually happen because the system tends to catch it and looks at trends before they become catastrophes. Again, the Swiss cheese effect. Studies of ER admissions. This is a little bit about elite hackers and our community's love affair with rock stars. Love the rock stars, no problem. They're all cool, very smart people. But we have to be careful of nobody in this room, but some people in the information security community have some version of, I don't know, adult ADD or shiny blinky syndrome. Again, nobody in this room, over there, but we tend to focus on the really cool stuff, right? The ODIS, the new exploits, the new ways to bypass existing controls, even if they get detected and you get arrested, whatever. So if they looked at ER admissions for heart attacks, basically you get rolled into an ER because you had a coronary, all the cool stuff you see in the ER documentaries and the ER shows, like splitting the chest and electricity and open heart massage and all this invasive, very expensive, kind of dramatic type of thing that security people and ER people tend to gravitate to. Not sure why, but it's just, again, not nobody in this room, but some people in this community tend to gravitate toward that dramatic stuff. But it's interesting because the most consistent winner in terms of effectiveness of reducing mortality when you get rolled into an ER is aspirin. What? Aspirin, over the counter, 4 cents a pill. What the hell, aspirin? I'm gonna crack his chest, open heart massage, there's gonna be some electricity, there's gonna be like super cool, there's gonna be blood, everything. No. You can do that if you absolutely have to, but before you do that, the moment that person gets wheeled in the ER, you will find someone who will open a little nylon bag and take a little aspirin and say, hey, aspirin, mouth, shot, swallow, check. There's actually someone on the team that's responsible and accountable for doing that stupid, small, undramatic, strategically important procedure, because no one will sue you for it, giving someone an aspirin in the ER. No one will say it's too expensive. And yet, despite universal agreement, this was absolutely the most effective thing and it had literally zero downside. They did studies. Why are 10 to 15% of the patients not getting an aspirin? That's ridiculous, right? Because again, what could go wrong? It's not that it costs money. It's rounding off error. It's not that someone will sue you for it. It's not an experimental, dangerous procedure. It takes a second to do. You don't have to get elite surgeon training to put an aspirin in someone's mouth, right? So what's the issue here? So they studied this and they said, hey, 10 to 15% we're not getting aspirin. That's an astronomical failure rate. And so they said, okay, we need to figure out how do we get people to actually comply with this concept of aspirin on arrival. And if you go to some hospitals' websites, they actually have an aspirin on arrival page on their website. It shows a little bar graph, national average, 95 or whatever. Our metrics, 98%. And then on the bottom it says, 98 is better than 95. Can't make that up. So we don't want to miss the evolving thread, the cool stuff, the blended threats, the ODAs, all those things. They're absolutely important because our industry changes so fast. We need to understand what's going on and what's coming over the horizon. In fact, that's my favorite thing to do, is to talk to CSOs and tell them, in 2 to 3 years, you will be spending money on this or else. And they tend to listen because, in some cases I'm right. But we absolutely have to also look at the very basic things of, hey, why are we missing this? And what is an analogy, what is an analog in this in information security? I don't know. We fired a major administrator in the Unix server farm. What did we forget to do? Whoa, we forgot to revoke his credentials. That might be him crawling up in our servers now. How did that happen? Because we forgot that, the basic stuff. Who was accountable, big word, accountable, for doing the stupid, silly, free, no one will sue me for it? Hey, Bob over there did something stupid, got him fired, and now he's crawling back into the network with his unexpired credentials, right? What's up with that? So, in some cases, a shiny blinky is really cool and important, but we forget to do the basic stuff that is absolutely important.
The problem is when you fire or get rid of the person whose job is to give the aspirin,
Yes.
or terminate the credential.
Yeah. So the question was, and he gets a shaker for that. Because that's absolutely true. In many cases, I worked in a nonprofit. I was the IT guy, I was a printer guy, I was a security guy, I was a physical security guy, I was a bodyguard for the people who came in from overseas, I was a bodyguard for people who came from New York. And I was like doing all that stuff. And if I had a problem with them, they would have been screwed. So a lot of places have like the IT guy, and if you're really hot speak, you're going to be the IT guy and you're going to be the security guy. So it's absolutely a problem, is how do we monitor the people who are responsible for those? Where's the accountability if you're kind of self-policing? And that's a resource problem and a management problem, not a technical problem, which is again layer 8. One of the interesting things is he also came in and said, because of accidents, kind of like in aviation, always multi-factor, liability is very doctor-focused. So when an airline crashes into a mountain, you don't go and say, hey, I'm going to sue that pilot. What? I mean, unless he was really doing something stupid, like drinking on the job, or I don't know, sleeping on the job, which happens very rarely, but does happen. You typically go in to sue the airline, not the doctor. The way...
That's because of the insurance.
Yes. So the way insurance works in the medical community is really weird, and I think we're going to see in information security a little bit of a risk management by insurance in the next, I don't know, 3 to 10 years. It's starting to happen. So that's kind of interesting artifact, is this fear and defensiveness on personal liability, even though they're part of a huge system that should be interlocking and working as a team. But the doctor, the MD, is going to be the one that's going to get sued and basically lose their career. One of the things that the big pushes in healthcare IT is putting electronic medical records online, and electronic medical record systems that allow the doctor to basically navigate through the care procedure and ideally spot human errors. Like, hey, you weren't supposed to give this person who weighs 180 pounds 0.1 per kilogram, but rather 0.001 per kilogram. It's the difference between death and not death, right? And so some of these things are really cool because they have the potential to stop human error type accidents. People are sleepy, they're tired, they're exhausted. It's bad. Talk to an ER doc or a surgeon or a resident, and they don't sleep ever. So the idea is, what he's seeing is that in some cases, these things are actually engineered by kind of the man to be a liability defense for the hospital and to create a workflow that's optimized for maximizing billing. Not necessarily patient safety. So in a lot of cases, the doctors who are the end users of these systems are being forced to use a system that is really, really complicated, takes a lot of time to go through, get trained on, and actually operate in the clinic every day. And they end up saying, hey, this kind of seems suspicious. It looks to me like it's really optimized for billing and liability, not for the care of the patient, right? So what ends up happening, and I know this doesn't happen in information security where we have informal documentation and conversations between people, kind of under friendly, but it happens in the medical community. And so what they end up doing is, because of these weird EMRs that are not properly designed according to the doctors, for patient care, they end up having a parallel chart system where the docs and the nurses kind of have these little, I'm talking around here, and you put the stuff is in the computer for the lawyers to see, right? And what ends up happening is that some of that stuff over here doesn't get documented over here, and so the next doctor might see it, gets transferred to a different hospital, and the electronic medical record is incomplete or otherwise problematic. Interesting, not sure what the InfoSec analog is for that, but somewhere this is happening in our community. I'm not sure where. Any thoughts on that? Not documented at all. Or documented it in a way that is more cover your butt and compliance than actual security, which would be patient health, maybe?
Well, sometimes it comes out to where you have to have an SOP. So you write an SOP, it gets stuck in a folder, but the SOP is 5 years old or 3 years old, and it's just become the normal undocumented pass from person to person lore. This one person knows everything. But the SOP is just dragged out every year to show the compliance officer that, yep, got an SOP, it's right here.
Yeah, so it kind of sounds like reducing liability, maximizing billing, but patient safety is kind of whatever.
We're also seeing issues between specialization and processes, where they're moving away from less specialized people and putting the blame on processes. And so if things aren't working, then we need more processes, because it's not the people anymore. We don't have enough process.
So that sounds a little bit like Deviant's talk today about TSA, where he said, use tech to support smart people instead of dumb people to support smart tech. Is that right? Yeah? Mark Silver, we'll run through this real quick. He's more of a business person who's never really fully technical. He's from Australia. He works now as a CIO for a major multi-billion-dollar portion of a global 50, I believe. And his success, according to him, is basically translating between the business problem and the technical problem. He worked for the Queensland government in Australia as a state government, basically, and said he explained to a minister who was in charge of all these multi-billion-dollar budgets that the size of encryption keys in terms of planets and atoms. So he found a way to translate by analogy and help someone understand a technical problem. That was his kind of initial beginning of the love affair with being a translator and an advocate for technology. InfoSec, at this very large global 60, I think, company, perceived as a business inhibitor. So what he ended up doing, which a lot of people talk about these days, but he actually succeeded in doing, because I followed this team for a while, embed InfoSec and identify InfoSec requirements at the beginning of the project rather than at the end. Minimizes the cost, and it's embedded in the culture. What the? Where have we heard that? What? So SDLC and secure coding and getting people to talk to us at the beginning of the project, is, hey, we're putting up a website, or I don't know, we're throwing up terabytes of anonymized information on the web. What could possibly go wrong? I don't know. De-anonymization algorithms with GPU clusters in the cloud, for example. So these things are happening, and so what they did was they discussed specific executive sponsorship, and a specific, very powerful executive was responsible for the success or failure of a project. It's accountable, and they created steering committees, and they were aware of the subtleties of security and communications with layer. Now, this might not seem revolutionary to you if you've done work at that level, but for a lot of people coming up to the technical ranks, this is kind of weird and scary. And so I think we need to figure out how to learn from people that have done this kind of stuff and emulate and model them. So a technically focused CSO, according to Mark, is doing a disservice by not having the right discussions with the CEO, CTO, CIO, CFO, board, etc. Technology secondary, focusing on the business conversation and defer to your technical people to help them translate that risk. Almost done. We talked about special operations a little bit. Special operations is kind of glitzy and interesting and cool. Most InfoSec is not quite so dramatic, right? But there are certain parts of InfoSec that require extremely high intensity training, extremely high intense skill sets that are very cutting edge, sharp, and revolutionary in some cases, or very flexible thinking. We looked at some academic analysis of what makes special operations teams special. How are they different than regular military? And there's actually just this many people, about 15,000 special operations forces on record, I guess, versus a really big multi-million person active military. And so Booz Allen did an article about what makes them special. It's very readable. You don't have to be a military person to understand it. I recommend that. Total immersion, very deliberate practice, extreme realism, constant feedback and after-action reviews. Does this happen in your environment? Are you comfortable with the kind of training you're getting? Right? Special forces folks are deep generalists that have a very core specialty, but they also cross-train with other people. So if one person goes down, they can kind of fill in the role, right? Everyone knows something about the other person's expertise. So they have a very deeply linked cross-functioning team. And they work in small teams in strange and hostile environments, and they get the job done because of their selection process and the extreme training they go through. So almost the end, 10 ways to get leadership to make their cases, a little bit of distillation. Achieve a strategic position, not a whole time to explain all of what that means, but figure out how to embed yourself in the culture and the executive group by understanding how they talk. Like you said, Marcus, you want to understand their language and what their priorities are. Work with champions, make security relevant, not FUD, but make security relevant to what they're doing. Dispel the media hype instead of being a part of it. Make it real in some way, try to quantify risk, get some good metrics if you can. They're coming out, they're not perfect, but they're starting to come out. Be part of the organization, help institutionalize security. And if you can, know the CEO and speak to them. Work with them. Get to know the executives if that's at all possible, and make them understand what you do. So, talk about that. Yeah. So basically, within information security, these are some of the things we're starting out with. Auditors should look beyond just the technology. Do you have a firewall? Do you have an intrusion detection system? Do you have antivirus? Look at actually how the people in information security talk to other parts of the business or within themselves. Ask them, how does this work? What do you do different? What kind of teamwork do you have? What kind of leadership do you have? Do you feel comfortable talking to them if you saw a problem? Have you ever talked to someone and said, hey, I have a problem? They said, shut up. If you're an auditor and you see that, dig a little deeper and put that in your report because that's actually a very important thing. Security managers, understand, are you the kind of person who would deter people from coming to you with problems, or are you the kind of person who would say, hey, it's irrelevant or relevant, I'll listen and figure out how we can create it. So figure out what your perceived power distance is between you and the people who report to you, and try to chip away at it if it's a little too hierarchical and formal. Actively manage your people. We talked about how Armor Guy did that. Provide training, live simulation opportunities. Send them to training. Get them exercises in the house. If you're in risk, look at people and processes, not just the traditional risk measures, but get some of that layer 8 type of stuff. And then governance. We need more into security culture. We need understanding of communication, sharing, and liability, and starting at the very top. That's it. Any questions? Yes. What's the question?
That's not a question so much as a comment. It's this idea, I really like it. But we've seen in other areas the flight industry uses a lot of people using it as an example because it has such high tolerance. But also in space career, looking at things like supply chain risk management, using the federal space, a lot of people are trying to apply similar models. Like, well, if we look at what's done in flight industry with chain of custody for airline parts or other stuff and try to apply that to software, people are trying to do that similar modeling in that space as well. So I think it's a good way to go.
Yeah, good use.
People take similar ideas, although the biggest problem is whenever they do that model, they realize how ridiculously far they have to go.
Yeah.
An established industry of many decades has versus what an established industry of like a decade.
Yeah, so Doug's comment was basically a lot of types of professions are trying to incorporate the 100 or so years of risk management culture from aviation into their particular risk chain or risk process. And it's not easy to do because it doesn't have perfect analogs, and again, there's that cultural change. And but I think we can learn from aviation and other high-risk professions to figure it out, and better start now than later. Huh? Cheers. And now, Mark Security introducing our man.
Hey, I apologize. He's absolutely right about that book. You can actually get that book on audiobook if you're anything like me. Around here it's great having audiobooks. You know, some people have up to an hour or so commute. So if you can download that book right now and listen to it on your own.